talk about the dark truth and the bright future of parking. And we're going to go through some introduction about parking, why we have the type of parking we have today, and where we're moving towards. And it's very relevant because the city of San Mateo is currently going through the process of creating a parking management plan for its downtown. And we're really looking forward to seeing that being finalized over the next several months. And with that, I'm just going to start it. And actually, I wanted to, since I was able to walk here today from where I live, I wanted to see how people got here today. So just a show of hands, how many walked today? Wow, okay, a good portion of us walked here today. How many biked? A few people. How many took the train or a bus to get here? A few. And how many carpooled to get here? Quite a few. And how many drove alone? It's good because we do have, since you're here, you found parking, so it's great. I would love to hear your stories about how hard it was to find parking. But we gave you instructions and directions to the Caltrain parking structure, and I hope you found that if you didn't find parking on the street out here. If you drive down B Street here, it's often full. Parking is full here, and people love visiting this area. So it's great to have these public parking facilities that are a little bit off the path, but that provide the parking that we need. So why do parking policies matter? That's what we'll be focusing on today. Well, we have residents who need to be able to park where they live and to get to destinations. So they need parking. Business owners want parking both for their employers or employees and for their customers. But it's funny because many local retail stores end up, if you do a survey of the people visiting them, maybe 10 or 20% of them drive to that store, and if it's a really local store. If it's a big regional shopping center, then of course a lot more are driving. Developers need to provide parking for their new development, depending on how much parking the city requires, and also to get the loans to be able to build the parking. And this is an area that is slowly changing in that lenders are now starting to realize that we may not need as much parking as we've provided in the past. And that's a good way of looking at it. Transit agencies, especially the regional larger transit agencies, need parking to encourage ridership, in addition to providing really good ways of accessing the station by walking, biking, and taking a bus to get to the train station, or a shuttle, for instance. And that goes both for Caltrain and BART here in the Bay Area, and ferry service as well. And regional agencies need parking in order to encourage continued growth in the Bay Area, for instance. As any region continues to grow, it will need parking. But what we can do in addition to just providing parking is making sure that we provide transportation options for people who don't need or who can't afford owning a car. And there are quite a few people who can't afford or doesn't have access to a car on a daily basis. So what happened over the past several or decades? Well, we built parking. We have our wide street networks connecting to these few buildings, and then we have these oceans of parking. And you can see how small the footprint of the buildings are compared to the space required for parking. And it's one thing when we build up, it gets expensive. When we spread out, it gets really hard to walk and to access these destinations. So we need to think about how do we make the choices we do when we move around. How should I get there? Well, let's see. It's a 1 mile walk. It's free. It's going to take me about 20 minutes. It's like from Caltrain up to Market Street, for instance, in San Francisco. Or it's going to take me 15 minutes on transit, and it's going to cost me a couple of bucks one way. And if that bus is actually coming on time, so maybe it's going to be 30 minutes instead. It could take me 10 minutes to ride my bike, but I'm going to the grocery store, so I'm going to drive. It's free, ample parking at the destination, and there's no real cost to me. But the problem with that is that the car does cost something. The average car owner spends about $9,000 every month, every year on their car, in loan and in all the maintenance costs and parking and other costs associated with owning a car, insurance and such, gas, of course. So what this does is that we're spending all of this money on providing parking that not everyone needs. This is a residential or a senior housing in San Francisco that actually only has about 20 parking spaces for 100 units. So 0.2 parking spaces per unit. And because it's a senior housing complex, that works because not all seniors have cars or need cars. And this project would not have been feasible if that parking were to be provided there, because it would have been too expensive for any developer to build it if they were to build 1 or 2 parking spaces per unit. Another example is the Gaia building in Berkeley, where we have roughly more than 200 residents in this complex and only 20 parking spaces for these residents. Many residents are students, or it's affordable housing too. It doesn't look affordable, but it's affordable. And students and people who live near this BART station, right? And they can walk and bike wherever, or take transit wherever they need to go. So we don't always need to provide 1 or 2 parking spaces per unit, per residential unit. So what goes into creating a parking space? Oops, now I turned that on. There we go. Well, if we build surface parking, it's fairly inexpensive. It may be a cost of about $5,000 in capital cost to provide that parking space. And that's just the construction cost. It doesn't include the land value. As we go up into a parking structure, the $5,000 multiplies into roughly anywhere from $20,000 to almost $100,000 for some parking spaces. It sounds insane, but that's the actual construction cost, depending on how constrained your site is and other factors. But say $25,000 on average.
Are you saying it's $5,000 per space, per parking space?
Per parking space. $5,000 per parking space versus $25,000 per parking space if you go up.
Okay, and then Gaia, what street is that on in Berkeley?
It's very near the downtown Berkeley station.
What if you go down?
Let's hold the questions, and that's the next one, actually. That can add easily an additional 30% to the cost. So $35,000 per space, or much, much more, with ventilation, water infiltration, and other issues that, if it's really tough conditions, soil conditions, etc. So we're looking at, it's not free. But we do assume that parking is free, and we want lots of parking. But our communities are changing, and we have everything from walking school buses and safe routes to school, where we're trying to encourage our kids to walk and bike to school. We have a millennial generation that loves being able to just access their destinations by transit and by other modes in order to be able to use their phones and connect with their friends while traveling. And we have a senior population who now is very interested in being able to walk and live in walkable communities. And not to talk about the health. Last session we talked about health and transportation as well. And being able to walk and bike provides that daily exercise that is so important to all of us. And having these vibrant communities in main street environments, it doesn't have to be a downtown. It's 25th Avenue, it's around 42nd Avenue. Other small villages and nodes that we have in San Mateo, for instance, that's the kind of environment we want to be able to walk and bike to. So we have the trade-off between the costs of parking and how much parking to provide, and what is the actual demand for this parking. And cities struggle with how to measure and estimate how much parking to provide for certain land uses. And we have a few tools, and the parking generation guidelines on the right here is one source. But you can also do your own parking occupancy surveys in order to figure out what is the typical parking demand in the city or in the specific district where you live. And well, I'm going to move on to here. But what if the number that you grab out of the parking generation guidelines is not the right for where your development is going in? And that's when it becomes important to do your own studies and figure out how much parking you actually need so you don't oversupply parking. And I'll get back to this. Oversupply of parking will generate more driving because you have the supply there, and it's free and it's ample, and it's the most convenient way to get there. So what might work here around the Italian social club may not work down in the Glendora district, for instance, or around the golf course. And what might work somewhere else may not work in another part of the city. So parking requirements that we've been used to hearing about if you go to planning commission hearings and city council hearings, you hear, well, this development has so many units, it needs to have this much parking. But if it's right smack downtown where more than 30% of the population accesses their destinations by other modes than driving, we don't need that much parking. So we treat parking as a need when we should think of it as a good, because now we know that parking is not free, right? Andres Duani is a famous architect when it comes to new urban town development. And he said, of course there's not enough parking. If you gave away free pizza, would there ever be enough pizza? And why do we treat parking differently than a cup of coffee? I need my coffee in the morning, but I expect to pay for it, either at home at a low cost, or at Starbucks or Pete's or the local coffee shop at a higher cost. And why do we tell people how much parking they need? It's like saying, you must have 2 beers for every 1,000 calories you eat. And this is the type of, I would love to see that we start thinking about parking not as a free good, but rather as something that's very costly and that is taking up a lot of valuable land and makes it very hard for us to move around. More personal choice to allow people to spend their money on their priorities, whether I as a resident want to spend several $100s a month on my parking in my residential unit, or for my residential unit, or if I don't have cars, why should I pay for that parking? To let the market provide various development styles and to allow the urban style development where there is demand for it, and to be more open to different tastes and circumstances. So just quickly into the dark truth about parking. And back to the parking generation manual and the guidelines, which are so great in some instances. But the problem is that we have these requirements that the city has established and put up in their zoning ordinances that in many cases have a much higher rate than the parking generation manual does. The parking generation manual may say that a certain residential type may need 1.4 unit or parking spaces per unit, but our requirements might say we need 2.2 spaces per unit. And the requirements were established back in the 50s when there was an immediate need for parking, and we had so much land, and we wanted to encourage driving because it was the future, right? And that just continued. These parking requirements have in many places not been changed for 60 years. So that's where we are now. How can we modify the parking requirements to actually fit the fabric of the neighborhood where we're developing something? Here's an example of a TOD, a transit-oriented development site. In this image, you see residential development, for instance. It could be a mix of residential and commercial, for instance. And the white are these residential and commercial buildings. And you have the parking on a quarter of the site. Again, if we think back about to the map or the image where we're looking just at the surface lots, you would have surface lots all around 4 times what we see here, or lots more. But that's if we assume that we have a need for 2.2 spaces per unit. If we drop it to 1 space or 0.9 spaces per unit, we instead are able to reduce the parking in half. So we're making a lower parking structure, and we're able to wrap it with retail or with residential. And we may even have room for a park. We could go higher and provide even more space for playground and open space, for instance. So this is something, even if we may want the parking and think of it as something great, which it is, it's very necessary to have enough parking, but we don't want to provide too much parking again. We want to make sure that people can get around by other modes and really enjoy the environment rather than think of all this parking. And it impacts the landscape. So you see the retail, the medical with the gray areas being parking, the office with all of its parking, and this farm or this field, open field, where we now add another use and box it out of the way to provide the parking up front. And this continues. And it takes up so much land that could be used for open space or whatever the demand is. And if we go into the actual office and look at how much space we have for an office, it may be 13 feet by 9 feet in a regular office. Parking is 18 feet by 9 feet. We actually spend more space on our parking space than on our office. And today, we would, especially with the tech industry and the flexible industry, it's common with 50 to 75 square feet per employee rather than the 120, 130 square feet per employee. And just bringing this, another example is this blighted parking lot that's been there forever. And we're wondering, why isn't something done on this site instead? And it's often because of parking requirements, because it's too tight to provide parking as you build a structure here. There's not enough room to provide underground parking because it's not going to be efficient. So instead, no building goes up here, no active retail or 24/7 environment where we get residents living here. And instead, we keep the blight in order to maintain our parking requirements. When parking could be centralized into public parking structures, something that San Mateo has done a really good job with all of its central garages, on-street parking, the movie theater parking garage, and the structure all the way up by Second and El Camino. And San Mateo has been able to really embrace a park once environment where you can walk between different uses, park your car, and wander around and enjoy both the movie and the coffee before and the restaurant visit afterwards. And the problem is that if we do keep the parking requirements as they are, at say 2 spaces per residential unit, or 4 spaces per office, per 1,000 square feet of office, then we can't encourage transit-oriented development or mixed use in downtowns or infill development. So if we do reduce or eliminate the parking minimums, is that the end of it all, or do we get more desirable environments? Here in the Bay Area, several of our neighboring cities are really starting to cut down on minimum parking requirements, and providing, for instance, parking maximums, which means that instead of, say, telling the developer you need to provide 2 parking spaces per residential unit, instead saying you can provide more than 1.5 spaces per unit, or you remove the requirement completely so that the market decides how much parking is built. And there is a market among a wide range of demographics, and in the green part of the pie chart are the people who are really interested in living in transit-oriented development and in mixed-use districts. And of course, I have 2 kids, and on days when I need to drive to baseball or to whatever activity it is, I use my car. But on most days, I really try not to. And I've chosen to live in downtown San Mateo for that reason, so that we can walk to restaurants, to Central Park, to the library, and we can bike out to the bay and bike over to friends whenever we want. And it's not possible for everyone. But what we can do is improve the nodes, the town, or the centers in and around San Mateo, in order to encourage more people to be able to walk and bike more often. And that's happening. It's happening. So instead of thinking about requirements for parking, we can start thinking about requirements for trip reduction measures, car sharing, unbundled parking, which means that instead of just assuming that everyone wants 2 parking spaces per residential unit, that you pay monthly for your parking, and then it becomes a real cost to you if you choose to pay for 2 parking spaces. And in some parts of the country, it's $100 or $200 or $300 a month, and in San Francisco. Here in San Mateo, it might be $30 or $50 a month. But if you have that on your monthly bill, then it becomes apparent to you how much you're spending on parking. And you can make a choice. I want to continue keeping my 2 parking spaces and pay for them. Or I can buy a bike and I can start biking more, for instance. And it encourages this type of development, which we have both in Burlingame and in San Mateo and in other communities or on the peninsula. So just quickly into parking structures again. I want to talk, parking structures are not evil at all. We need them, and they're good for the economy of a downtown. Again, it's a matter of finding the balance between how much parking and the access of other modes we provide. But what should a city, for instance, think about when deciding whether to build new parking or not? Are there underutilized parking structures or parking facilities that can be used? Maybe they're privately owned and standing empty. Can we encourage some kind of shared parking agreement? We have the costs associated with, actually I'm gonna back up here, so you've seen this. So $25,000 per space adds up to a lot of money, just in the capital construction cost. Add in the actual land value and the operating cost. And we're looking at, even for a surface lot that may have a construction cost of $5,000 per parking space, that actually comes down to $70 to $120 per month if you include the land value. The downtown lot has a very high cost for the land, right? The monthly cost for a surface lot may be as much as $300 to $500 per month that we're subsidizing, because no one is paying this much money to park in a park. Well, in some parts of San Francisco, we do pay $300 a month for a surface lot parking space. In an urban parking structure, the monthly cost may easily be $350 to $400 per month. And in a suburban parking structure where the land value is lower, it's $100 to $300 per month. Several plans around the Bay Area are now really starting to grasp the costs associated with parking. And when I say plans, I actually mean cities and public agencies. And developers as well. They could actually avoid building a parking structure for several $1 million by utilizing its existing facilities more efficiently. So then, now I want to go into what do you do when you decide, what can you do when you decide if you need more parking or not? BART parking, for instance, and the cost of this structure is very, very high. But luckily, a BART, for instance, can get capital funding to build it, and they build extremely strong structures that have low maintenance costs and operating costs. So the costs to the passenger are not that high, but they're definitely higher than we're paying right now in a BART structure, which is $1 or $2 a day at most stations. Again, the empty parking lot. Maybe this parking lot or parking facility can be used rather than building a new parking structure. How do we afford the cost per parking space? Are there revenue sources that we can encourage? Or can we do another occupancy count of the area around us and decide that there is ample parking and that isn't privately owned, that's actually publicly owned? We can, again, make more efficient use of our public parking facilities by providing information, real-time information about how many parking spaces are actually available in a parking structure. And up in the, let's see here, up here in the upper right, the park assist that you see there, it actually monitors and shows if a parking space is available with a green light or if it's occupied with a red light. So when you enter a level, you immediately see if your car, or if there's a parking space available for you. So you don't need to drive slowly or wait for the car that's about to pull over, or someone just entering their car. Instead, you can see the space at the end of the aisle and drive straight there. And it's funny with this structure, it's from Santa Monica, actually, and they also have kiosks when you enter the garage, and you can type in your license plate number, and it will actually tell you what floor you're on and guide you to your space. So technology is advancing very, very rapidly when it comes to parking payment and technology to show how much parking is available. Is it cheaper to invest in transit access or walking or biking improvements? How can the land value be improved by turning a parking lot into something very, very active? That's another question to ask. So what should we invest in? We could build a 5-story parking structure for this new development. We could remove a couple of layers and instead invest in trees, vegetation, a park, open space, and a playground for the kids, and bike facilities. And all of a sudden we have a combined, with a combined effort, providing parking, as well as facilities for those who don't or can't afford owning a car. And in, let me see here, yeah, we're getting close. And this is one of the BART stations. This is MacArthur BART. And what we see on the right here is their removal of the surface lots and building a parking structure along with both affordable housing and market rate housing at the MacArthur BART station. So we're activating the area from what previously was a very, very crime-ridden BART station to something that is becoming very vibrant and inviting and easy for people to walk through to get to the station. Richmond Parkway is a great example of where there are gaps in the infrastructure for walking and biking and taking transit. This is a bus hub. And if we're looking at the half mile, and I'm actually going to go to my numbers, I think there are about 4,000 residents within a half mile of this, 4,800 residents living within a half mile. But only 1,350 of these residents can actually be reached within the half mile walk, the 10-minute walk. And if we're looking at the bike bike radius for a 10-minute bike ride, we have 60,000 residents within biking distance within 10 minutes, but only 23,000, or 38%, are can access that bus hub within the 10-minute bike ride. And as you can see, we have some significant gaps here that could potentially be fixed in order to increase how many people can access the bus hub by foot or bike. Here's what you see over here is the bus hub. And we have a home just across this intersection. And I wish I could walk, but it's actually gated up here in the back. And if I do walk, there's no access to get across this big intersection here. Instead, I need to walk for 50 minutes to get to the station. So what we could do is really improve the access for this neighborhood by providing access or cut-throughs in the fence and in that little meadow or field that you would have to cross, and providing crosswalks at that intersection. And you would reduce the time spent walking from 50 minutes to maybe 5 or 10 minutes. High minimum parking requirements often result in a supply that exceeds demand. So there's too much parking. And it encourages auto-oriented development because more people will drive. This leads to traffic congestion, air quality issues, energy consumption, and social justice consequences. It also results in a low demand for multimodal transportation. Multimodal transportation is biking, walking, taking transit. And it also makes it so that it doesn't make sense to price it because there's so much parking available. It also leads to a higher vehicle ownership rate and auto use, which in turn will encourage even higher minimum requirements. So this is something that we can really think about, whether does it make sense? Is this really the dark truth, or is this something that we want to continue doing? What can we do to break the cycle? It does have unintended consequences today when we're trying to reduce emissions and become healthier and be more cost conscious as well. So now that I know that parking is not free and that I spend on average $9,000 a year on owning a car, I can compare the different modes in a different way. Walking is still free at 20 minutes, transit $2, 15 minutes, biking is free at 10 minutes, but now the car drive will cost me some money, and I can take that into consideration when I make my decisions. Maybe I end up getting rid of one of my cars and use car share for those trips. And car sharing is, for instance, Zipcar, city car share, and peer-to-peer car sharing that you may have seen in your neighborhoods, where I can borrow my car or rent my car to a neighbor or someone who wants to use my car for a couple of hours. And I can make some money, and my neighbor doesn't have to own a car. And all in all, this improves our possibilities of creating a more vibrant community and also a healthier community. Just briefly on the system perspective and on parking management. So up until fairly recently, many cities and many developers and many property owners have decided that they want to keep their parking supply private and not shared with other users. And that means that we overbuild all of this parking and we have empty parking lots. Both San Mateo and Redwood City are doing a great job with thinking about the Park Ones approach, where even the county garage in Redwood City is open for free parking on weekends and evenings, whereas all the other parking in downtown costs money. And Redwood City has been in the forefront on the parking management implementation by also varying the cost of the parking. So the parking fee is slightly higher in some areas of the city or of downtown. You see the orange area here, compared to the yellow streets where it's slightly lower because there isn't as much demand to park there. So in high demand areas, the parking fee can be slightly higher. In low demand areas, it can be free or lower. Santa Monica, going back to Santa Monica, provides great, and has been doing for several years, information online about how much parking is available, so that you know when you're heading downtown, you'll check this map and you know, oh, my favorite parking structure actually has 50 spaces right now. I think I can make it so that we can park there. Back to this whole idea of finding the right price for parking. And the right price for parking is the lowest price at which a few spaces are always available. And Professor Shoup, some of you have read The High Cost of Free Parking. It's a thick 1,000-page book on parking and parking economics. And just like with any other good, it's a matter of finding the Goldilocks principle, or Goldilocks, the balance, where we provide enough parking by adjusting the price or the fee up and down. So per hour, it may be on this street it's 50 cents per hour. On the other street, more attractive streets, it's $2 per hour. And cities can achieve these goals by setting curb parking prices to yield about an 85% occupancy rate. And privately owned parking has been doing this for years, and public agencies are now catching on. So it's not necessarily just a revenue source. It is really a matter of managing your available parking supply. And also, with the new revenue that may be generated, it can be reinvested into access improvements and new street trees and more power washing on the sidewalks and that festival that we want to have. And so a city can choose what they want to do with that revenue. SF Park, some of you have heard and seen the signage in downtown San Francisco, and there's information available online on where parking is available and how much it costs in real time. And we have smart payment technology to help us out now. We don't need to carry tons of quarters with us every time we go somewhere. Instead, we can pay with credit card or even with our phone. And by thinking about parking not just as the on-street parking as its own category of parking, and parking structures as a different group of parking, and private parking as a third group of parking. If we think about parking from a holistic perspective and treat it as one, and then use that to set what the price is, what the fee is, depending on where you are, that means that some off-street parking, some parking structures will be free, and whereas B Street or Third Avenue will likely have a higher cost to park there because they're the most attractive spaces. And with the real-time wayfinding system, it would also be even easier to see, am I prepared to pay $2 for the hour I'm staying right now, or do I want to pay for 50 cents in the parking structure around the corner? So that you, now all of a sudden you have access to the spaces on top floors of parking structures that you didn't even know existed before. So it's all about creating a good signage system to find this parking. And utilizing valet operations as well, where you pay maybe $7 or $8 to have someone drive your car to an underutilized parking facility and not having to worry about your car. Just very, very briefly, the concept of conventional development. We have our school, shop, play, and work. We have our parking structures in front of our uses. We have El Camino, for instance, as an example, where we have our big arterial that carries thousands and thousands of cars in a day. I drive Sally to school. I drop her off. I drive to work. I drive to pick Sally up to go to her softball practice. I drive to shop with Sally in the car, and I leave Sally at the softball field, and I drive to the store to shop, and then I pick Sally up, and we go home together. As you can see, that's a lot of driving in a day. And we have a lot of turning movements on and off El Camino. And as we all know, the turning movements take time. It also makes it so that we have longer signals to get through. And sometimes we even get stuck at a signal for a couple or one cycle because there's so much traffic. In a mixed-use Park 1's district, and think around 3rd Avenue, for instance. Not that we have a school and everything right there, but as an example. We come in, and we have our parking structures that are now consolidated and in parking structures instead. I drive Sally with me, and she walks to school. I go to work. She goes to her softball practice, and I do some shopping, and we meet back at the car, and we drive home together. And we have 2 turning movements instead of 10 or even more. And the results are that we may need only half the parking, half the land area dedicated for parking, a quarter of the arterial trips on El Camino, and 1/6 of the arterial turning movements, and a quarter of the vehicle miles traveled, for instance. And this is just an example, but it shows how beneficial it is to have Park 1's environments where we can run a lot of errands and get a lot of stuff done in order to live our daily lives. And with that, I want to wrap it up and open it up for questions, and just think about the things we can get in regards to a vibrant community if we focus on not having ample parking available at all times. Thank you.